Christianity is different than other religions in that, according to Christians, Christ claimed to be God. According to the Christian scriptures, Christ said he was equal to God. Christ said, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Now, other religions may talk about supernatural laws, Hinduism, smaller gods that might help you along the way. Buddha went through all sorts of stuff to discover the way of enlightenment and says, follow me on these 8 paths and you will find enlightenment. Muhammad claimed to be the last prophet after Moses, after Jesus, and said, follow me to Allah. But Jesus said, I'm not telling you how to get to the Father. What I'm telling you is that there is the only way to get to the Father is through me. And then Jesus spent a lot of time in the Gospels talking about why he was equal with God. So I would like to spend some time talking about that. This video, I would like to talk about the authority of the Christian Scripture and who Jesus is in regards to the Christian Scripture. And then going on, I would like to talk about extra biblical sources that verify that Jesus is God. I'd like to talk about archaeological evidence. But to begin with, when you are looking at veracity in any kind of literature, you have to first take a look at what the text says about the text. What does the text say about itself? And so that's the first test. And then what's the outside sources say about the text? What's the archaeological evidence? What's the historical evidence? You have to take a look, when you're talking about ancient manuscripts, how well were the copies transcribed? And then one of the ways to tell accuracy in literature is there condemning information about the authors? And of course, when it comes to Christian Scripture, what is the role of prophecy? In the Old Testament and the New Testament, and when the Old Testament is the Jewish Scripture, the Tanakh, which is an acronym, frankly, for the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Nevi'im, which is the prophecy books, and the Kettim, which are the writings. And so that's what makes up the Tanakh in the Jewish Scripture. That's what makes up the Christian Old Testament. And for Christians, the Old Testament is incredibly important because Jesus' ministry came out of an Old Testament culture. He was a Jew. And he followed the Old Testament, and so did his disciples. They were all Jewish. And so the entire environment in which Jesus ministered and in which the New Testament was written was an Old Testament, a Jewish, an environment based on the law, based on the prophets, based on the writings of the Old Testament. And the Old Testament is incredibly accurate because the Jews were very, very conscientious about transcribing their manuscripts. They saw them as holy. In 1949, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and they were parts of all of the books of the Old Testament. And some, as a whole, Isaiah was a whole manuscript. Deuteronomy was a whole manuscript. There were parts of manuscripts from all of the books of the Old Testament, 39 of them, except for Esther. And when they are compared, and they date from the 3rd, 2nd century BC, so 200-300 years before Christ, they were collected. They were copies of the Old Testament, and they were kept in these caves along the Dead Sea, discovered in 1949. And when they compare the parts of the Tanakh or the entire books of the Tanakh with modern day manuscripts, copies, it's incredible how precise they are, how much they are alike. So the Old Testament has been for a long time very, very important for the Jews and important for them to copy. They have scribes, and they have had scribes for years whose only job is to make sure that their sacred literature was accurate. Now, the New Testament was written between probably about 40 and 70 AD, 50 and 70 AD actually. Some folks think that the books of John were written after 70 AD. I don't. But even so, if you go from 50 to 70, when the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, or if you go a couple of decades beyond that, still you've got a corpus of writings that was done fairly quickly after the death of Christ, which occurred probably in about 33, 34 AD. So, in all, what Christians would call the Old Testament and the New Testament was written over the course of 1,500 years. And it was written by 70 plus authors. No one really knows who wrote Job. No one really knows who wrote the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. But overall, it is a long period in which the Christian scripture was written. And the entirety of the Christian scripture is about Christ. So Sam Harris calls, he's a philosopher, modern day philosopher, and anti-Christian. He writes actually very clear philosophy, but he doesn't believe in the authority of Scripture at all. And he writes derisively, he says, do you really think that there's a magic book out there? A magic guide? And the answer for Christians, and frankly, the answer for Jewish folks, the answer for Muslim folks is yes, there is. The Jews would, look at the Tanakh. The Christians would look at the Tanakh and the New Testament scriptures. The Muslims would look at the Quran. So And here's one of the reasons why I think it's magic, is because over the course of 1,500 years, you have a very, very clear theme of Christ. So I would like to spend some time talking about the veracity and authority of Scripture, and then how that underlines who Jesus claimed to be, and how that underlines what his disciples wrote about in the New Testament, and who his disciples claimed that he was. So, and I would like to take a look at not only the Scripture itself, I would like to take a look at the prophecies of Christ. There are over 300 of them that are fulfilled in the Gospels. I would like to take a look at the continuity of the Old Testament and the New Testament. I would like to take a look at the extra-biblical historical evidence, and I would like to take a look at the archaeological evidence. And just as a way of kind of thinking about this, the amount of copies of the New Testament are incredible for an ancient document. So by the time, shortly before Gutenberg's press in the 15th century, there were thousands of copies of the New Testament. That's what the monks did. And if you compare that with 200 copies of Homer, 7 ancient copies of Plato, 49 ancient copies of Aristotle, it's really amazing. And what's handy about that is the number of copies that you have help you to discern what the errors are. If you've got 5 copies that say Jesus is God, okay, well, that's nice. If you've got 24,000 copies, including translations in other languages, that we have today of ancient copies, well, then you've got quite a bit of assurance of what the text actually says. So in the next video, I would like to start exploring the reasons for believing the authority of Scripture, and in particular, reasons for believing in the Gospels as historical records of who Jesus is.